Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to immerse ourselves in this wonderful, ongoing, and open conversation that we call Torah. We are in the last Torah portion in the book of Genesis, Vayechi, which begins with chapter 47, verse 28. We'll read through the English translation of our portion together, and I'll share with you a focus study about it, and then we'll have our collective collaborative conversation about it. If you'd like to go ahead and unmute it this time, together we can recite our blessing, giving thanks for this moment. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for the opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships. Torah. And now if you can go back on mute, we'll read through our English translation. I'll share the opening verses with you, and then I'll invite others to have an opportunity to read as well. Once again, we're in the book of Genesis, chapter 47, beginning with verse 28. Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt, so that the span of Jacob's life came to 147 years. And when the time approached for Israel to die, he summoned his son Joseph and said to him, "Do me this favor. Place your hand under my thigh as a pledge of your steadfast loyalty. Please do not bury me in Egypt. When I lie down with my ancestors, take me up from Egypt and bury me in their burial place." He replied, "I will do as you have spoken." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed at the head of the bed. Richard, would you like to continue the very start of chapter 48?
Yes, thank you. Sometime afterward, Joseph was told, "Your father's ill." So he took him with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to see you," Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "El Shaddai appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me. And he said to me, I will make you fertile and numerous, making of you a community of peoples. And I will give this land to your offspring to come for an everlasting possession. Now, your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, shall be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, no less than Reuben and Simeon. But progeny born to you after them shall be yours. They shall be recorded instead of their brothers in their inheritance. I do this because when I was returning from Padan, Rachel died to Massaro while I was journeying to the land of Canaan, when still some distance short of Ephrath, and I buried her there on the road to Ephrath, now Bethlehem.
Thank you, Richard. Steve, would you like to read a little bit starting at verse 8?
Sure, thank you. Noticing Joseph's sons, Israel asked, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." "Bring them up to me," he said, "that I may bless them." Now Israel's eyes were dim with age. He could not see. So Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see you again, and here God has let me see your children as well."
Thank you. Sherry, you want to read starting at verse 12?
Thank you, Rabbi. Joseph then removed them from his knees and bowed low with his face to the ground. Joseph took the two of them, Ephraim with his right hand to Israel's left, and Manasseh with his left hand to Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it upon Ephraim's head, though he was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, thus crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn, and he blessed Joseph, saying, "The God in whose ways my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd from my birth to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, bless the lads, in them may my name be recalled, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they be teeming multitudes upon the earth."
Thank you. June, would you like to continue there at verse 17?
Thank you, Rabbi. When Joseph saw that his father was placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought it was wrong. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's. "Not so, father," Joseph said to his father, "for the other is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head." But his father objected, saying, "I know, my son, I know. He too shall become a people, and he too shall be great. Yet his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall be plentiful enough for nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you shall Israel invoke blessings, saying, God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, "I am about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. And now I assign to you one portion more than to your brothers, which I wrested from the Amorites with my sword and bow."
Thank you. And David and Susan, would you like to continue at the start of chapter 49?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. "And Jacob called his sons and said, Gather round, that I may tell you what shall befall you in the days to come. Assemble and hearken, O Jacob's sons, and hearken to Israel your father. Reuben, my firstborn are you, my strength and first yield of my manhood, prevailing in rank and prevailing in might. Unsteady as water, you'll no more prevail, for you mounted the place where your father lay. You profaned my couch, you mounted."
Simeon and Levi are partners. Instruments of violence are their plan. Let me not enter their council, nor let my being join their assembly. For they killed a man in their wrath, and in their whim hamstrung an ox. Cursed is their wrath so fierce, and their fury so harsh. I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel.
Thank you both so much. Jim, would you like to continue there at verse 8?
Thank you, Rabbi. "You, O Judah, your brothers shall praise, your hand shall be on the neck of your foes. Your father's sons shall bow low to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. On prey, my son, have you grown. He crouches, lies down like a lion, like the king of beasts who dare rouse him. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, so that tribute shall come to him, and the homage of peoples be his. He tethers his ass to a vine, his ass foal to a choice vine. He washes his garment in wine, his robe in blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, his teeth are whiter than milk."
Thank you, Jim. Marty, would you like to continue there at verse 13?
Thank you, Rabbi. "Zebulun shall dwell by the seashore. He shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall rest on Sidon. Issachar is a strong-boned ass, crouching among the sheepfolds. When he saw how good was security and how pleasant was the country, he bent his shoulder to the burden and became a toiling serf. Dan shall govern his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the road, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that his rider is thrown backward. I wait for your deliverance, O Lord. Gad shall be raided by raiders. but he shall raid at their heels. Asher's bread shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. Naphtali is a hind let loose, which yields lovely fawns. Joseph is a wild ass by a spring, wild coats on a hillside.
Thank you so much. Dave, would you like to continue there at verse 23?
Archers bitterly assailed him. They shot at him and harried him. Yet his bow stayed taut, and his arms were made firm by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, there the shepherd, the rock of Israel. The God of your father's house who helps you, and Shaddai who bless you, with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that couches below, blessings of the breast and womb. The blessings of your father surpass the blessings of my ancestors. To the utmost bounds of the eternal hills, may they rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the elect of his brothers. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he consumes the foe, and in the evening he divides the spoil.
Thank you, Dave. And Catherine, would you like to start there at verse 28?
Thank you, Rabbi. All these were the tribes of Israel, 12 in number, and this is what their father said to them as he bade them farewell, addressing to each a parting word appropriate to him. Then he instructed them, saying to them, I'm about to be gathered to my kin. Bury me with my fathers in the cave which is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave which is in the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre in the land of Canaan, the field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah, the field and the cave in it, bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished his instructions to his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, and breathing his last, he was gathered to his people.
Thank you. Mark, would you like to continue at the start of chapter 50?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Joseph fell on his father's face, and he wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. And 40 days were completed for him, for so are the days of embalming completed. And the Egyptians wept over him for 70 days. When the days of his weeping had passed, Joseph spoke to Pharaoh's household, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, speak now in Pharaoh's ears, saying, My father adjured me, saying, Behold, I am going to die in my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. There you shall bury me. So now, please let me go up and bury my father and return. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father as he adjured you. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and all Pharaoh's servants, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt went up with him. And Joseph's entire household, and his brothers and his father's household, only their young children and their flocks and cattle did they leave in the land of Goshen. And chariots and horsemen also went up with him, and the camp was very numerous.
Thank you. And Robert, would you like to continue there at verse 10?
Yes, thank you. And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, and there they mourned with a great and very sore lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians. Wherefore the name of it was called Abel-Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. And his sons did unto him according as he commanded them. For his sons carried him into the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, which Abraham bought with the field for a possession of a burial place of Ephron the Hittite before Mamre. And Joseph returned into Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went up with him to bury his father after he buried his father.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you. I'm very grateful. And Justin, would you like to continue there at verse 15?
Thank you, Rabbi. Now Joseph's brothers saw that their father had died, and they saw, perhaps Joseph will hate us and return us all the evil that we did to him. So they commanded messengers to go to Joseph and say, your father commanded us before death, saying, so you say to Joseph, please forgive now your brothers' transgression and their sin, for they did evil to you. Please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept, and when they spoke to him, his brothers also went and fell before him, and they said, behold, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid, for am I instead of God? Indeed, you intended evil against me, but God designed it for good, in order to bring about what is at present to keep a great populace alive. So now do not fear. I will sustain you and your small children, and be comforted. He comforted them and spoke to their hearts.
Thank you so much. Kath, would you like to read starting at verse 22?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. So Joseph and his father's household remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph lived to see children of the third generation of Ephraim. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were likewise born upon Joseph's knees. At length, Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die. God will surely take notice of you and bring you up from this land to the land promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, when God has taken notice of you, you shall carry up my bones from here. Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That's our entire Torah portion, which also concludes the book of Genesis, Sefer Bereshit. If you'd like to go unmute this time, together we can say the special prayer that we say upon the conclusion of a book of Hazak Benit Hazeh. Be strong, and we shall strengthen together. With that, I'd like to share with you a bit of a focused study on this portion. And then we will have our collective conversation about it. So if you have a copy of the study sheet, please take it out. And I've titled this study An Open Composition, and we'll explore how I see that sense of an open composition. And we'll, towards the end of the study sheet, we'll also look at the painting here by Georgia O'Keeffe. So our Torah portion opens up or begins with these words, Vayechi Yaakov, Jacob lived. One of the things that Rashi notes and troubles him is that there is a scribal rule that states that there's supposed to be a space of at least 9 letters between the end of one Torah portion and the beginning of another Torah portion. And he observes that there's something different about this Torah portion as the way it is inscribed. on a Torah scroll, which is that there's a space of only one letter between the end of last week's Torah portion and the beginning of this Torah portion. And so that is termed a closed portion. And he wonders, Rashi, why is there the topography of the way this is written? Why does it create a sense of a closed end? Why is this last Torah portion closed in this way, the way it's written in the Torah scroll? And so that's what he explores a little bit as he goes through his commentary. And we're going to see one of the ways in which this opens up the discussion is that there's something that is provocative about this final Torah portion in the book of Genesis, which is it defies our notion about what it's supposed to look like. And some of the opening passages also kind of challenge our notion about how do you tie a major storyline up? How do you tie up this storyline that is going to be the last portion that deals with these individuals that we've now been following for months, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and now Joseph. And so this is going to tie up these individual stories. And now, as we know, we're going to move on in the book of Exodus to a story about an entire people. And that will be the primary character, if you will, in the remaining books in Torah. So how do you tie up this saga of these individuals, this family that we've been following? And just as this portion, by the way, it appears on the Torah scroll and by the subjects that we're going to be exploring and the issues that it raises, really defies our notion about closure, about how a story should end. So too did the beginning of the book of Genesis kind of defy our notion about how a story is supposed to open up. Because as we explored at the very beginning of our study of the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis opens up with the first letter in it being the second letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And there's something that's kind of curious about that. Why it would be unremarkable if it had started perhaps in the 15th letter or the 12th letter or the 17th letter. But the fact that it starts on the second letter gets us to wondering, well, if you're going to start on the second letter, why don't you start with the first letter? And so we explored how there's a lot of commentary tradition that says it's a hint that this is not the beginning, it's a beginning of a story, that there may be other beginnings lying out there in some multi-universe, if you will. And then we also discussed how the very first word, Bereshit, is supposed to be followed by a noun, and instead it's followed by a verb. And so even before we've taken a breath, we become a little unsettled by how Bereshit is challenging us on so many levels. And Rashi himself, with the opening of Bereshit, says, look, this really isn't about the order of creation. It's about something else. And that gets us to wondering, well, what is this whole book about? What's the opening of the book of Genesis about? So instead of getting us started on a path that's clear about this is how things began and this is how things proceeded, we start off with a kind of having the firmness under our feet kind of crumble away, and we're left just wondering what is going on and what is this all about. And here, now that we come to the concluding portion in Genesis, the same thing is happening, both by the way it looks and by the issue it deals with and how it deals with them. We begin to think, what does it mean to reach some kind of ending? So we're going to explore that. And here's one way in which we also get confounded, which is what happens as Jacob is on his deathbed and Joseph brings his children, Jacob's grandsons, to be blessed. And as we read, Jacob switches hands so that one hand that should be on the oldest child, he places on the younger child, and the hand that should be on the younger child, he places on the older child. And we have here in verse 17, when Joseph saw that his father was placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he thought, well, this is wrong. Well, so Jacob himself is now upsetting some kind of order that we should expect to see. And so he is confounding our notion about what should be happening. Okay. And now we get to something even stranger. And this is a story that's told in the Talmud, here number 3. After they had finished dinner, Rabbi Yitzhak said, this is what Rabbi Yochanan said. He said, our father Jacob didn't die. Rabbi Nachman looks at him and says, well, what are you talking about? Surely there was eulogizing and embalming, and they buried him. What do you mean he didn't die? They did all those things and he didn't die? And then Rabbi Yitzhak says back, well, look, I'm just interpreting a biblical verse. So here's the Hebrew context for all this. When you read the story about Sarah's death and Abraham's death and Isaac's death, it uses the Hebrew word for they died. For Sarah, it says vatamat. For Abraham, it says vayamt. For vayamat. For Isaac, it also says vayamat. He died, she died. With Jacob, that word isn't here. It only says he expired. So I had a lovely email exchange with a friend today who, after reading what I had written in the weekly email, says, what's confusing about this? He says, isn't it clear that he died? It says he expired. And that's a term that doctors use all the time, right? When they say, oh, the patient has expired. And so I wrote back and I said, matters of beginning and ending, life and death are far more ambivalent than sometimes we're willing to admit. I said, here, even in this country, we have a debate going on about when does life start? Does life start with conception, with viability, with the emergence out of a womb? And I said, even death, even when does death occur? It is really a very recent debate that we've had. Up until the early 60s, the definition of what constituted death was the cessation of respiration. And then in 1968, a bioethics committee at Harvard came up with a definition of death that was different, which was brain death. And about 10 years after that, a committee, a legal committee, came up with a uniform law that defined death as the cessation of brain activity. And that law was quickly adopted by most states, but that's really only going back maybe 30 years since we had a definition of death that was different than the one that had preceded it. So when does death occur? When does life start? These are really ongoing debates that we have. And I want to suggest, I would not be surprised, although I'm not a cultural anthropologist, I would not be surprised that there are many non-Western cultures that have a much more fluid sense of life. When does life start? When does life end? And so forth. So here in our Talmud, we have this lovely notion that, look, Jacob didn't die because it didn't say that he died. It just said he expired. So here again, this material is now causing us to have a sense of, well, when did Jacob end? When did his life end? Did it end? And so that ambiguity is embedded in the text that we've been reading. So here, if you turn over number 4, we have this this lovely bit of commentary by the 19th century Hasidic rabbi, the Sfat Emet. Even though he was in the land of Egypt, he knew that all of Egypt was just a hiding, inside of which there was nothing but that divine life force. And now the Sfat Emet will harken back to the Talmud portion that we just read. In the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan says, Jacob, our father, did not die. When the sages objected, but was he mourned, embalmed, and buried for nothing? Rabbi Yochanan answered, look, I'm just interpreting scripture. When a person seeks to interpret scripture and struggles at it, oral Torah is created. Such a person can find some of the light that comes from Jacob, our father's living, even within the hiding. So here, Sfat Emet is saying, when one is provoked to not be satisfied that the text has somehow reached a conclusion about what has happened and invites us to explore it more deeply, we're adding to the conversation. We have been invited by the ambiguity of the text to become further creators of the text itself. And that, Sfat Emet says, is what it means when Torah continues to be alive, to the extent that we haven't settled the matter, if you will. And so here is, going back into the text in number 5, Rashi is now going to comment on this deathbed scene that we've just read, where Jacob begins to comment. And in chapter 49, it begins, and Jacob called his sons and said, come together that I may tell you. And in my edition it says, what is to befall you in days to come. But the Hebrew is, I will tell you what will happen in Baharit Chayamim, literally in the end of days. So Rashi understands that as meaning Jacob, the visionary, the seer, if you will, is about to reveal to his sons something about eschatology, the end of all days, the end of times, when history comes to an end, when narrative will come to a conclusion. And so he's there on his deathbed, and Rashi says he's about to tell them all that, and then all of a sudden something happens, and he shifts topics. And this is what Rashi says. He wished to reveal to them the end of all exiles, but the Shekhinah departed from him, and he began to say other things. So as if Jacob there is about to say, this is the way the world is going to end, the way the story of all stories will come to an end, and then he pauses, and either something overcomes him or he overcomes himself, and perhaps decides, what kind of a gift is that to give my children and their children, to tell them how everything is going to end? That will deprive them of the opportunity to make lives for themselves. It will deprive them of the experience of continuing to wander through life with all of its surprises, with all of its fractures, with all of its opportunities to make decisions for themselves. So he avoids doing that, and instead he begins to just describe each of the sons and some of the characteristics. So this leads to a little bit of commentary I'd like to share with you about this nature of this phrase that we have adopted, that we've used, I think most of us over the last few decades of, I need closure. I need a sense of closure. And I was kind of thought about that as we're dealing with a concluding Torah portion and Rashi's own commentaries here about there's something about the desire for closure that Jacob is wise to avoid. And I wonder, where does that notion about the desire for closure come from? And I have to say, I learned something this week when I discovered it's really very recent. It wasn't until the late 1980s that we have this phrase that's coined called the desire for closure, the need for closure. And it comes from a social psychologist, Ari Kuglansky, who now teaches at the University of Maryland. Ari Kruglansky grew up in Lodz, Poland. He was born in 1939. He and his family lived in a Jewish ghetto. They managed to survive the Holocaust. And at the end of World War II, they then immigrated to Israel. And then eventually Ari Kruglansky comes to the United States. And he develops this and coins this phrase, the need for closure. And here, number 6 is from an article that he wrote with Donna Webster in the Psychological Review. The need for cognitive closure refers to individuals' desires for a firm answer to a question and an aversion to ambiguity. And Professor Kruglansky develops he calls the need for closure scale, which is a way to rate people based upon studies and interviews that he does with them, where people rate on this scale of a need for closure. And that need for closure scale measures the degree to which a person has a desire for certainty. And the people who score high in their on that scale tend to value order. They dislike ambiguity. They make decisions and form impressions very quickly and have very strong opinions. And of course, you can anticipate those who score low will have very different characteristics. Of course, Professor Kruglansky says, look, we all need to make decisions and we all are on various points on the schedule, but his particular studies, especially in the last 15, 20 years, have focused on what happens during times of high polarization and high sense of crisis, and the tendency that people have to quickly leap to a need for certainty, to avoid ambiguity, make decisions very quickly, and shut off any further collection of information that might undermine whatever certainty they have reached. So I put this together with what happens within art and literature. And this is from a book by literary critic D.A. Miller called Narrative and Its Discontents, Problems of Closure in the Traditional Novel. And he writes, the narrative of happiness is inevitably frustrated by the fact that only insufficiencies, defaults, and deferrals can be told. Traditional narrative is a quest after that which will end questing. Closure is an act of make-believe, a postulation that closure is possible. So what D.A. Miller is dealing with, which is something that philosophers and critics have been dealing with for centuries, is basically how to bring a work to a satisfying conclusion without being false to the boundless nature of human life. How can you end a story without, if you will, defiling the notion that, well, look, but many things are possible. Things don't have to end the way that they do. You know, I also think about Alice in Wonderland, and there's, if you remember the trial that happens towards the end of the story, you have the White Rabbit who's been called as a witness before the king, and to testify, well, what's been happening here with Alice and what's this all about? And the White Rabbit says, where shall I begin, please, your majesty? And the king says, well, begin at the beginning and go on till you come to the end, then stop. Well, if only it were that simple. So here in this work of art from Georgia O'Keeffe, what we have is there are works of art which are closed and works of art which are open. Works of art which are closed are those that lead us as either readers or viewers to a preconceived end. And it is if we are being instructed about something. Whereas an open work of art is one that draws us in not as detached viewers, but as active participants. We become invested, if you will, in the story. And we begin to wonder about the possibilities rather than merely wondering about, okay, how is it going to end? And we're presented with an ending that we accept. So here is the notion about an open or closed composition is not merely reflected in written works of art, it's also reflected in two-dimensional forms of art. And that's what we have here today. So here is this work of art by Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe, who is travels to New York when she's about 20 years old, and she becomes attached to the gallery that's operated by Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz, who's the son of German Jewish immigrants. He himself goes with his family when he's about 20 years old, 18 years old. They spend about 5 years in Europe traveling around. He comes back and he's exposed during that period to avant-garde in Europe. He opens up an avant-garde art gallery, probably the only one that was exhibiting that kind of work of art at the beginning of the 20th century. And that's where George O'Keeffe not only encounters art, she becomes romantically attached to Alfred Stieglitz, and they remain romantically attached until he dies. And she is attracted to the photography that Stieglitz and his friends are exploring, and she becomes attracted to photography as a way to magnify reality, to get close-ups of what reality is. And here's this work of art that she calls a blue flower. So before I just invite you to share what you see there in that painting, structurally, I just want to point out how the shapes there are, first of all, they extend off the canvas for one thing, but they're also fluid, organic, they're not linear. And in that sense, they cause us to keep moving. Our eyes move across this undulating vista that is this painting. And even though there are aspects of the painting that take us off the canvas, because of the flow, the fluidity, we flow back into the picture. So the notion of where is the end of this painting? And does this painting even have an end? Or is it something that goes on and on and on? Is part of why I share it with us this evening. She said, there's nothing is less real than realism. That there's something about what we say is a realistic depiction is not really what life is all about. That life is also all about the wonderings and the possibilities. And I want to suggest that's what Torah is trying to tell us through Jacob and through the very structure and design of this last piece in the book of Genesis, which is that life comes to an end only when we are certain, absolutely certain about everything. And that life is full of ambiguity, and the ambiguity inspires wondering. And that, I want to suggest, is what an open composition like Torah is all about. It's designed not to end our thinking, but to provoke further wondering. And with that, I'd love to hear what you saw either in this painting, in the text, and if you raise your hand, I'd love to call upon you. Oh, Catherine, please.
Okay. both the text and the painting. In the text, what I got from Breshit is that there's always a problem of succession. We have these deaths, and there's a question of succession. And the first question comes up around Jacob and Esau, and then we have again repeated with Ephraim and Manasseh. And so that opens up this question. And so in a sense, what's implicit in that is, where do we find leadership, within this? And in terms of the painting, I see both birth and death in the painting at the same time as being co-present. The lower quadrant of the painting, I see birth happening. It's almost as though there's a woman giving birth. And then we have this plume, and there's a dark plume in the distance.
Go ahead, Kevin.
That seems to signify death. And so we have this co-presence there.
That is beautiful. I hadn't seen that. That is fantastic. And I just want to say also, you use that word succession. I never saw it, but I know there was this grand TV show, right? Series called Succession.
Yes.
And then you also got me to think about King Lear, the play by Shakespeare,
Yes.
which is also in part about succession and involves women, and it involves also madness, and then it also involves a fool, and the richness that's there about the notion of succession and letting go, if you will. Thank you so much. Very rich, Kat. Thank you. And then Jay, and then Kat.
First of all, I had not seen the word hiding used in that context. Does it mean a skin or a covering, like a hide? That Egypt was like a hide, and inside is something that you can't see. And the second thing is that when Jacob's name and Israel's name are used interchangeably many, many times, and I'm looking at some commentaries that say there's a reason. At one point, he's the human being Jacob, and at one point, he is Israel, which is all of us. It's very complicated. The third thing is, if anyone has the opportunity, while this was going on, and I was reading the blessings, which didn't seem quite like blessings. They were utterances by Jacob. I wouldn't want to receive as Yehudah, yes, that would have been fine as being Judah, but I wouldn't want to be a couple of the others. Not too good a future in that blessing. But if you look at Chagall's stained glass window creations of the 12 tribes for the Hadassah Hospital, I happened to glance first at Reuben's, and actually part of that blessing is in Hebrew in Reuben's stained glass window. And then I glanced at some others, and there are symbols taken from these blessings. I'm sure they're taken from other parts of Genesis and all where they're introduced, but it's incredible how, on some level, how intensely Chagall had interpreted these sacred words and put them into art.
Oh, thank you for mentioning those windows. And thank you also in particular, for mentioning this notion about hiding. So when the Sfat Emet is talking about hiding, he's talking about the extent to which life can be a sense of exile, a sense of hiddenness. But Sfat Emet says, even within that hiddenness, there is the life force of God. And what he seems to be suggesting is that when we don't accept at face value what we see, and when we engage in lidrosh, when we engage in interpretation, which is what Rabbi Yitzhak, what Rabbi Yochanan is doing, he says that releases some of that divine force that's hidden within this dimension that we're living in. And so not to accept something at face value, but to dig into it, break it open and to see some other possibilities there. That releases the life force. So thank you very much for bringing that part. Kat. Go ahead and unmute. Yeah.
Yep. Apologies for being late. What I was pondering about what you were talking about when does life start and when does death start? And several things came to mind. One was in this portion, if I'm thinking sort of historically, in the time for the Jews, they would be buried, and in some ways the process continues because the body decomposes and goes through these different phases of decomposition. But for Jacob, they embalmed him, so that stopped that natural process that the Hebrews would have of continuing on. And that really struck me. And then I think of in Buddhist practice, my Buddhist practice aspect of it, we talk about it as continuation, because that which ends up being born is already growing and developing, and then after we die we go in, back into the earth, and if we're cremated we go in the air. I mean, we continue on. So we actually, there are those in Buddhism that will, instead of calling it a birthday, it's called a continuation day, because it's a continuation of something that's already going on, which I kind of like. There's Thich Nhat Hanh used to do calligraphies, and one of them, which is one of my favorites, is called "Smile to the Cloud in Your Tea," because inside that cup of tea is water, and it's the little bits of tea leaves and the earth and the farmers that harvest it. I mean, it's that interbeing. It's all woven together. It's not necessarily linear. It's that it's intergrowing and living and processing. So a lot of that for me was coming up while I was reading this portion.
Fantastic. I'm going to get back to a couple of things that you said in just a moment. Let me call upon Marty.
Thank you. George O'Keeffe's paintings it's often noted that they often sort of suggest female genitalia. You noted that in some of your comments. And so they're, in a sense, pregnant with possibilities. They're creators of life. They're more than just flowers, and they show the, almost sort of the relationship between other life forms and human beings. And in this particular portion, it's also sort of I see sort of an analogy in terms of possibilities and pregnant possibilities, because you asked how do you end the chapter. Well, he's now described that the leaders who will become the 12 tribes of Israel, and he's also given some, at least a thumbnail sketch of each of their personality characteristics. So that that seems to be both a beginning and an end. They don't actually get to the land of Israel, but later the tribes will. So I see that as sort of as a natural sort of way of ending the story about the beginning of how the patriarchs developed to the tribes. And then this is really trivial, but about the embalming for Jacob, it makes perfect sense they would embalm him, because he has a long trip to go back to Machpelah, to the burial ground, and he would decay terribly on that long journey if he wasn't embalmed. And the others could quickly be put into the ground. And of course, Jewish law requires that they go into the ground within 2 days. But because he has this long trip, it made perfect sense that he would be embalmed.
Oh, thank you for bringing all that material in, Marty. I'm going to come back to some of it in just a moment. Let me call upon some others who've got their hands up first. Robert, and then David and Susan.
Yes, thank you. And thank you again for a lovely evening. So let's see, where is it? It's so tiny on my phone, 48:17. And when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand upon the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. And he held up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head. And it goes on. You know, it's interesting. Christ said the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And in the Baha'i writings, it says, no one knows what his own end will be. And it goes on to say, how often has a sinner, I'm paraphrasing, at the hour of death become a believer, and a believer at the hour of death, lost his faith. Practically, it reminds me of our resistance to change and to seek truth. Because we can become so embedded in what we hear, what we're told. I call it a shoebox. When I have conversations with my friends, I say, there's some people who live in a shoebox. I think Mark and I have even talked about that. They're not open to new possibilities. Doesn't mean they have to change their mind, but I think what it means is we have to examine. That's what I get out of that verse. We have to examine and be flexible. And if there is scripture or guidance from God, or if there's someone who knows more, and there are plenty of people in my life who know more than I do, but then I have to be open to that and not resist. And that's a skill. And then it requires a lifetime of learning, for many of us. And then the last thing is, at the death, what endures but good works? And I think we could say, yes, his physical nature died, but what of his spirit? I mean, even now, his spirit lives on. We're benefiting, I certainly am, from the example that Jacob set. So no matter how we understand it, that continues, and it will continue on, because those good works and wisdom, they endure. That's just my thought for tonight.
Thank you so much. Beautiful, very powerful. And let me call upon David and Susan.
I had a thought. It suddenly struck me that art and literature that I grew up with, Western art and literature that I grew up with, was often or largely closed. A painting would hold a whole story. A book would have a beginning and an end. A movie would have a resolution where the bad guys lost and the good guys won. Now, in popular fiction and popular media, the Marvel Universe, for example, there is sequel after sequel after sequel. In romance, writers don't write one-offs anymore. If a romance writer writes something that's popular, by God, they write another one and another one and another one. There is no end in popular fiction. Now, I'm exaggerating, but it seems to me that there is a major change in at least the way people consume art. And I'm using, of course, art extremely broadly, but that's what grabbed me.
I would just want to say quickly, there was an article, I think I read it today, maybe in the New York Times, about how there's now, as you mentioned, the Marvel Universe in particular, which produced all these sequels and so forth, and then spin-offs that were based upon sequels, and then they have their own sequels. The article was about how people are getting tired of how much information they need to carry from one movie to the next, how much background information you need to know about Captain Marvel and Captain Marvel's origins in order to be able to appreciate the third or fourth or whatever it is iteration that's now on the screen. And so there seems to be a resistance to having that level of open and unclosed, if you will, singular a movie. But But I appreciate very much what you're saying, and I'm going to bring it back to several points that were made. And one is Kath was hinting at different cultures have different degrees of comfort with either a rigid sense of life and death, and other cultures that are more comfortable with a more fluid notion about life and its ongoing cycle, and death being just the self moving into some other dimension or other experience or other replication of itself. And so to take it back to this painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, and as Marty mentioned, there is this intense fertility dimension to it. And what Catherine mentioned about, she sees there both death and life on the same canvas, as if the artist is saying there is something that they are related to one another. They are not sharply distinguished experiences, if you will. And it's fascinating to think about how George O'Keeffe, she did all this great work primarily when she was in New Mexico, in particular, Ghost Ranch, New Mexico, right? Which is kind of an intriguing thing about what does it mean, Ghost Ranch, New Mexico. But so on this canvas, she is taking nature, and as Catherine say, she's presenting it not as nature as a rigid boundaries between life and death, but a more undulating, circular, perhaps, at least undulating relationship between life and death. And so, to the extent to which she has also portrayed that on a canvas, that causes us to kind of roll, our eyes roll on this canvas. And sometimes they roll so far they roll off the canvas, but then we can, the shapes allow us to roll back onto the canvas. That is I think, one of the great examples, at least in painting, of an open composition, which causes us not merely physically to roll off and on the canvas, but what's on the canvas to explore the extent to which there's no rigidity to the story that it's telling there, just as there's no rigidity to the actual plastic nature of the way she's presented it. And I want to suggest again that what Torah is encouraging us to do is to see and approach life as an open composition, that Torah itself is an open composition. And we know that the way the Jewish Bible ends is not with some kind of clear resolution about the story, because the Jewish Bible ends with the Israelites being in hiding, in exile in the Persian Empire. And the king of Persia says, you're free to go. You can leave this exile, go back to your land, rebuild the temple if you want to. And it doesn't end with all the people of Israel saying, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. And that is what we're going to do. And that's what they did. And they went back to Israel and they rebuilt the temple. That's not the way the book ends. It ends as a cliffhanger, if you will. It ends inconclusively because we pick up the story, because we are the ones also in exile, if you will. We are also the ones that are in hiding. And the question is, the voice is saying to us, you're free to leave this place of exile. You're free to go out of hiding and to go back into a settled place, into a homeland, into a sovereignty of yourself. You don't need to live under me. You can go be sovereign people. And so that's what the challenge is that the entire Jewish Bible presents to us. Do you want to be a sovereign self? or do you want to just be passive and be a subject of someone else? So, Richard, would you like to add something? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it goes with this. I noticed last week, Joseph had said this journey is on earth, in brackets, has been so long. And it gave me the idea that, well, on earth is just part of your life. And today, I remembered when Jacob saw the ladder, and the next day, it says Jacob resumed his journey. And the footnote says, resumed his journey, literally lifted up his feet and went on his way. Well, now, today, he says, I'm going to die. What did he do? He lifts up his feet. So we're always in movement. And I was thinking too, maybe there's that 9 months in the womb. That's a life. There's a lot going on in there. So it never ends. And we have a choice, as you say, to be sovereign in our activity. But it's clear that this business of picking up his feet, there are these junctures, and we call it life and death. And I'm going to die, and I'm going to go to this next dimension. So he lived, but he didn't die.
Yeah. So thank you, Richard. And if Torah starts off, and if the Jewish Bible ends with a sense of the inclusiveness, how inconclusive the story is, and how it's designed to cause us to continue to wonder, that kind of wondering is best done not in solitary self, but it's best done within a community of people who also wonder and who give one another permission and who inspire one another to wonder. And so I just want to thank each and every one of you for helping to create that kind of a community for me, to be given the permission to wonder, to be inspired to wonder, and that we can share one another's wonders with each other. God bless you all. Thank you so much. Look forward to our next gathering. Be well, everyone.
Hey, God bless us
Thank you.
all.
Good night.
Bye. Good night. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.